Well, welcome back to season 6 of Vaughan Stocks, and this time we're going around the world looking at my then and now books I've written and photographed, and we're starting with Singapore. Stand up for Singapore, do the best you can, reach out for your fellow man, you've got to make a stand. Recognize you can play your part, let it come right from your heart, be prepared to give a little more. Stand up for Singapore. Sounds a bit like a Coca-Cola ad, doesn't it? And it nearly is, and I'll explain in a minute why. But first I wanted to say something about the then and now books. These are photographs, then photographs, old photographs I collect up, and I might collect over 100 for 80 spreads in the book, and then I go to the place and I photograph from exactly the same shot the original was taken, say 100 years ago or 50 years ago, whatever it was, and we see how it's changed. And so you see a pairing of one photograph and another with some explanation I've written underneath. But the books aren't really just about photography books. I mean, they are that if that's all you want. But they're also about how lives have changed, how people have changed, how their demands have changed, and how that's reflected in the changes that you see around us, all over the world. And one of the things you have to remember, when I go abroad, I might choose a very interesting place. But when I get there, the building is suddenly covered with scaffolding, so I have to scrap that one, or it might suddenly become a car park. Somebody's knocked it down, it's now a parking lot. But let me just explain this by, first of all, let's just take a look at one or two in this book here on Singapore, and I'll try and explain what I mean. Here, for example, in 1945, is the waterfront in Singapore with all these old buildings and things like that, and you can see them all down here. And then this is what it's like now, or a couple of years ago, and they say, well, what's the difference? And that it completely changed. Well, it hasn't quite, because just down on the right hand side there you'll see that some buildings have been restored, and they're the only things kept from the past. And on another one here, you look at this one, it's interesting, something that's right in the centre of Singapore, which is the cricket club. It shows what the British Empire thought cricket was important enough to put it right in the centre of the city, is the Singapore Cricket Club, and this photograph dates to 1906. Very grand cricket club with a cricket pitch there, and the cricket pitch is still retained, as is the club, but the surroundings have changed rather. And this one here, this is the causeway between the mainland of Malaya and the Singapore Island, and that's a causeway that was taken in 1924, and you can see it's a sort of two-road track. But this is what it is now, a huge motorway. I photographed this from a high-rise nearby. I sort of crept up to. I have to sort of do a few naughty things, to get inside places to take the photograph. And there in the background you can see on the Malaysian side of the Johor Straits the huge development that has taken place because of the economic success basically of Singapore, and how that has rubbed off on Malaysia itself. Well, that song it does sound as though it's written by an advertising agency, and you'd be absolutely right, it was. It was written by a guy who worked for McCann Erickson, and he is Canadian. And you say, well, why have you done some sort of bland song like this? It's a key song for Singapore nationality. Well, one of the reasons is that Singapore it's important sometimes to do something rather bland, because Singapore is made up of so many different cultures. In fact, that's part of its the ethnic cultures, race cultures and so on, religious, and it's that sort of melding together but also keeping the separate identities that's been the special trick of Singapore, and I think has allowed it to become one of the great economic powerhouses of the world, even though it's a small city. But it's, I mean, just to say very quickly, Singapore started out, as far as we were concerned, the British Empire, as a backwater of Malaysia, an island right on the southern tip of Malaysia, which was just a fishing island, little fishing island. It was mosquito ridden, right on the equator, very hot and sticky, still is of course, but it commanded the pinch point between the oceans of India, the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, and therefore for the emerging British Empire, and in this particular case the East India Company and somebody called Stamford Raffles, it was perfect place to make an entrepot, to put a sort of power base, a Royal Navy base, and also a trading centre. And of course it became very important in the trade between India and China in the opium trade in the 19th century, and it grew very rich on that. And Stamford Raffles, who founded it, was a person who was from a very ordinary background. He worked for the East India Company, and he was something of a he certainly was anti-slavery and anti-slave trade in his time when he founded that in 1824, he suffered for it, not that he knew anything about it when he died, because in where he's buried north of London, the local vicar refused to have him in the graveyard because he had opposed the slavery and the slave trade, and the vicar had had lots of shares in slavery, as many people did of all classes in Britain, as is now coming out. But he was responsible in many ways for encouraging people from different cultures and countries to come and work and live in Singapore, and that's why you've got the largest contingent from South China, Chinese. They speak Hakka and also Cantonese mostly, and you also have Indians, many Indians from all over the subcontinent, who became Singaporean, and of course Malays, and there are other cultures as well, of course, including the British, who ran the show for a long time. One of the things that happened in 1895 is that in Singapore they discovered how to tap rubber without damaging the trees. So you can imagine what happened then with the advent of the motor car and the rubber tyres and things like that, and of course Singapore expanded, boomed on the rubber trade as the main entrepot, not just a sort of traffic going through the straits of the pinch point, the straits of Singapore between the Pacific and the Indian Ocean and back again, but also generating its own income from rubber. And it was a very interesting place to be, because the British had actually encouraged all these different cultures together, and it was a relatively peaceful place. But the British also were worried about the fact that the growing power of Japan between the wars, and so they used Singapore to build a huge military base, the largest outside Britain actually, biggest naval base in the world at the time. The problem was that when war broke, when the Japanese invaded in 1942, the British thought any invasion would come by sea rather than through the jungles of Malaya. How wrong they were, because 30,000 Japanese troops came on bicycles, a lot of them, through the Malayan jungle into the back door of Singapore, over those straits I photographed you with along that canal, and came in there, and there were 70,000 British Empire troops, but they were bluffed, and the British Empire troops under a General Percival, we went and we capitulated to the Japanese. And Churchill called it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. And for me, I mean, people say, well, the British Empire ended when Suez, when we couldn't do anything about Suez in 1956. But really, it ended in 1942, because then they could see the Emperor had no clothes. Stand up for Singapore, do it with a smile. Stand up for Singapore, you'll find it all worthwhile. Believe in yourself, you've got something to share. Show us all you really care. Be prepared to give a little more. Stand up stand up for Singapore. So it was the end of empire, really, and but somebody else came along, equivalent in Stamford Raffles in a way, over 100 years later, who made the modern Singapore. And he was Chinese, Singaporean Chinese himself, Lee Kuan Yew, but we'll call him Harry Lee, because that's what he was known as when he was a university student at Cambridge after the war, 1949, and when he became a London barrister. And he's responsible more than anybody else for the modern Singapore we see today. And he wanted to reinvent it when it became independent from Britain, which he succeeded brilliantly in doing, although there was some cost to it, because it meant that he ran it rather like I suppose a boarding school headmaster, in which everybody had to behave themselves, no running in the corridors and all that sort of thing. And so things like gay love, drugs certainly, which was death penalty, political marches and things like that, and even the press were rather suppressed, and it was a rather sort of bland society. But to be fair to him, one of the reasons he wanted it bland was the fact that he had all these different cultures all mixed together, Indian and Chinese and Malay, just to mention the big three ones. And that's one of the reasons why you've got a concocted national anthem almost with Stand Up for Singapore. I don't know why they didn't call it Sing Up for Singapore, but there we are. But it's one of the reasons why there's sort of like a bland overlay to make this whole thing work together. And you have to say it has worked very well indeed. But in 1980, in the 1980s, I don't know exactly when it was, 84, so because lots of languages were spoken in Singapore, it was decreed that English should be the language, the lingua franca of the country, and in fact it became that. The city-state became English. Everybody had to speak English properly, and it was from that time that the economy really took off, because he realised that English was the international language of commerce, of economics. This is what you had to have apart from politics, and so it's from that time that you saw the growth of Singapore into what it is today. And Harry Lee, when he retired eventually, which took ages, and he still was a shadowy figure in the background, but during that time after he retired, Singapore became much more easygoing. Clubs opened and things like this, and it became a much more sort of like a Western society, not to the same extent as in America or in Britain, for example, or Germany, but it was certainly, as far as the East Asia is concerned, a very much more of a democratic, open society, which it is today in many ways. But its main thing is that it is, I think, perhaps the it's got the highest education, the highest literacy, one of the highest literacies in the world. It's certainly got the highest medical standards in the world, and they say, apart from it being the least corrupt in the world in terms of politics, which is true, it's probably the safest country in the world to walk around in. It is like the ultimate city-state, a sort of almost like a reinvention of an idealised version of I don't know, Athens, or in the Renaissance, so like Florence. And it's not too bad to say, well, it's not one of those sort of places. It doesn't have great art and things like that. Actually, it does, because if you go around Singapore, as I did, photographing it and looking at it, you see there historically everything you want to know about the past, certainly about the past 100 years of the British Empire. If you wanted to take them to one place, say, what happened to the British Empire? Well, one of the places I'd choose, how did it happen? What happened to its demise, to its growth? And so Singapore would be a perfect place where you could explain more or less everything. And it's got that. So it does retain its historic parts, and I think that's important. It's been done with some care, a great deal of care. And it's also got things, apart from things like its great universities and its symphony orchestras and so on, it's got this wonderful museum that's only been open a few years, called the Asian Civilizations Museum, which is, the go-to place if you wanted to go to one place to find out how Asian civilizations have developed over the last 3,000 years. and it's managed to do that, I think, because it does straddle at least 3 East Asian cultures, probably more. So when you think about the failure of Britain there in losing its empire, starting there, and how we were run out by the Japanese and came back and so on the other hand, if you wanted to cite a place, and it's not fashionable to do it now, for colonialism, which isn't many bad things about colonialism, but if you wanted to find a place that actually came about as a result of colonialism and was a success for the British Empire, look no further than Singapore. Singapore, our home and nation, together with determination, joining like we've never done before. Stand up for, stand up for, stand up for Singapore. And when you go there, you must have a Singapore sling. Of course, in Raffles Hotel, you've got to do that. But my favourite thing there is actually Singapore noodles. Can't beat them.